The Point and the Causeway, Chapter 16 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Without an instant's hesitation, Kelderek flung himself forward into the deep water. Immediately, almost before his shoulders had broken the surface, he felt the current turning him bodily and sweeping him downstream. For a few moments he struggled, afraid, as he found himself helpless against it. Then, awkwardly, he began to swim, bending back his neck to keep his head above water, splashing with his arms and bobbing up and down. Looking ahead, his water-blurred eyes could still make out the shape of the bear, like a rick swept away in a flood. Soon he realized that some freak of the river was carrying him towards the center, where the flow was swifter yet. Even if he should happen to touch upon a random spit or submerged bank, such as formed and dissolved continually in the strait, he would not be able to stand up in a current of this strength. Already he was beginning to tire. He tried to look about him for a floating branch or anything to which he might cling, but could see nothing. His feet, trailing deep, encountered some tangled loom-like thing, intersticed and pliant, and as he jerked himself free, pain flickered up his leg and was gone as quickly as a spurt of flame. An instant later he spun round in an eddy, swallowed water, sank, and, as his head came up again, found that he was facing upstream and still drifting on. The women among the reeds were now far-off, indistinguishable figures, appearing and disappearing as his eyes rose and fell. He tried to turn and face ahead, and as he did so, heard across the water a spluttering call, "Kelderek! Inshore!" Takominian, swimming behind him, was about halfway between himself and the shore which they had left. Although he appeared to be holding his own more easily than Kelderek, it was nevertheless clear that he had little breath for talking. He flung up one arm and gestured sharply towards the reeds, then fell once more to his task. Kelderek saw that he was trying to overtake him, but could not because of the slower current inshore. Indeed, the gap between them was widening. Takominian raised his head and seemed to shout again, but Kelderek could hear nothing except his own hard breathing and the splash and gurgle of the water. Then, as he bobbed upwards for a moment, he caught faintly the words, "Shore, before the point!" As he grasped the Baron's meaning, fear overcame him. He was being carried along the southeastern shore of Ortelga at a speed as fast as that of a man walking. As long as he remained in midstream, he could not count on drifting against the submerged causeway that ran from the eastern point to the mainland. More likely he would be carried over or through it, pummeled down by this very current in which he was now struggling for his life. And if he were carried below Ortelga, he could not hope to come ashore alive. He began to kick out and to clutch at the surface, panting and tiring himself still further. How far was it now to the point? The right mainland bank seemed actually closer than that of Ortelga, yet how could that be? Then he recognized the place. The reeds had been cut back, exposing a sheet of open water beyond which, on the island shore, stood the zoan tree. Tall and far off it looked, much further than when he had last sighted it, returning to Ortelga on his raft. He thought of the Shendron, perhaps looking out at this very moment through the silvery fronds. But the Shendron, for all his vigilance, would never catch sight of him. He was nothing but flotsam, a dot moving in the grey light and grey water of early morning. By God, there was something else, though, that the Shendron could not have failed to see. A little behind, but directly between himself and the zoan tree, Shardik was drifting like a cloud through a pale sky. There was no commotion of the water round him, and the long wedge of his jaw lay half submerged, the nostrils just clear, like those of an alligator. As the hunter watched, the bear turned his head for a moment and seemed to be staring towards him. At this, desperate though he was, Kelderek felt a return of that brave impulse upon which he had thrown himself into the river to follow Shardik. Shardik had called him for some purpose of his own. Shardik had power to preserve and raise up those who gave him all, doubting nothing. If only he could reach Shardik, Shardik would save him. Shardik would not let him drown. As the zoan tree dropped out of sight, he set himself with the last of his strength to swim inshore across the current. Slowly, very slowly, he began to converge upon the bear. As he came by degrees into the slacker stream, the distance between them lessened, until at last they were floating side by side and only a few yards apart. He could do no more. He was exhausted, conscious of nothing but the deep water beneath him, the fear of drowning, and, somewhere far out of reach, the presence of Shardik. He could see neither sky nor shore. "Accept my life, Lord Shardik. I regret nothing that I did for you." Losing the power of thought, sinking, no longer breathing, arms flung upwards, fingers clawing at the black, fainting dark, and now, in death, he felt once more the shaggy hair, the flank of Shardik, just as he had felt it when he walked beside him at nightfall into the forest, and slept in the safety of his presence. The darkness burst apart. He caught his breath and drew in the air. Sunlight was glittering on the water and sparkling in his eyes. He was clutching Shardik's flank, hanging by his clenched hands, tossing up and down, while beside him the great off-hind leg trod water as fast as mill-wheels strike. Scarcely able at first to realize what had happened, he knew only that he was alive and that he could still get ashore before the town was left behind. The bear had not turned its head or tried to shake him off, and indeed seemed unaware of him. He was puzzled by its indifference. Then, as his head and sight grew clearer, he sensed that it was intent upon something else, some purpose of its own. It was turning shoreward, to the left, and swimming more strongly. He could not see over the ridge of its back, but as it turned still further, land appeared beyond its shoulder. A moment later, it was waiting. He let his feet drop, touched bottom, and found himself standing, submerged almost to his shoulders, on firm stones. They came ashore together, the bear and the man, close to the now cold cooking fires, the cluster of storage huts and servants' quarters lying shoreward of the Sindrad. Shardik, in his eagerness, thrust the water aside, splashing and shouldering through the shallows, as though in pursuit of prey. Suddenly Keldorek saw the way of it. The bear was hungry, famished, desperate for food at any cost. Something had turned it back from the dead belt, but nevertheless it must have smelt food while lying in the forest, and this was why it had plunged into the river. He remembered what Belcodrazet had said before leaving the Tuginda. "If it begins to plague Ortelga, I promise you I will have it killed." Stumbling and still half drowned, he began to follow Shardik up the slope of the shore, but tripped and fell his length. For some moments he lay inert, then raised himself on one elbow. As he did so, 2 men appeared from behind the nearest hut, carrying an iron cauldron between them and making for the water. They were bleary-eyed and tousled, scullions routed out of bed to the first chores of the day. The bear was almost on top of them before they looked up and saw it. The cauldron fell to the stones with a booming sound, and for an instant they stared, fixed in grotesque attitudes of shock and terror. Then, shrieking, they turned to run. One disappeared by the way he had come. The other, blind with fear, blundered into the wall of the hut, hit his head, and stood dazed, swaying on his feet. Shardik, following, reared up and struck him. The blow knocked the poor wretch bodily through the wattle and daub of the hut wall, smashing it open in a ragged gap. Shardik struck a second time, and the wall collapsed, bringing down part of the roof above. The air was filled with dust, and with smoke from the new-lit hearth buried beneath the ruins. Women were screaming, men running and shouting. A burly man in a leather apron, holding a hammer, appeared suddenly through the haze, stared a moment, petrified, and was gone. Above all the hubbub rose the growling roar of Shardik, a sound like the sliding of heavy stones down a hillside. Keldorek, watching from where he had fallen, saw the bear lumber away into the smoke and confusion. Suddenly he felt hands under his armpits, and a voice shouted in his ear. "Get up, Keldorek! Get up, man! There's no time to lose! Follow me!" Takominian was beside him, his long hair streaming water as he dragged Keldorek to his knees. In his left hand he was holding a long, sharp-pointed dagger. "Come on, man! Have you got a weapon?" "Only this." He drew Sheldra's knife. "That'll do. You can soon grab yourself a better." They dashed forward, round the burning ruins. On the further side was lying a man's body, the backbones like a snapped bow. Beyond, the bear was dragging the carcass of a sheep from beneath the debris of a second hut. A little further off, 4 or 5 men, on the point of flight, stood staring back over their shoulders. Takominian leapt to the top of a pile of logs, shouting, "Shardik! Lord Shardik is come!" Round him the tumult spread wider as the whole town woke to the alarm. It was clear that there were those who had been awaiting his return. Already men were gathering about him, some already armed, others, half naked from their beds, clutching spits, axes, clubs, whatever had come first to hand. Dragging the end of a burning roof-pole from the ruins behind him, Takominian brandished it above his head. The second hut had caught fire, and the smoke had begun to obscure the sunlight. As the heat and noise increased, Shardik, disturbed from the sheep's carcass, became uneasy. At first he had glared about him, defying the strange surroundings as he satisfied his hunger, crouching in the posture of a cat, to rip and chew the bloody flesh. As the dusky air began to waver and cinders blew out towards the river, he winced and snarled, cuffing at a spark that fell on his ear. Then, as the center post of the second hut fell its length, with a crash like that of a felled tree, he turned, still clutching the haunch in his mouth, and made off towards the shore. Takominian, surrounded now by a shouting crowd, pointed with his dagger and raised his voice above the din. "Now you have seen for yourselves. Lord Shardik has returned to his people. Follow me and fight for Shardik." "He is going," cried a voice. "Going? Of course he's going," yelled Takominian. "Going where we shall follow him, to Bakla. He knows Ortelga's as good as taken for him already. He's trying to tell you there's no time to be lost. Follow me." "Shardik! Shardik!" shouted the crowd. Takominian led them forward at a run towards the Sindrad. Keldrek heard the shouting grow to a roar. Fresh smoke rose, followed by the unmistakable sounds of fighting, orders, the clashing of weapons, curses, and the cries of wounded men. Picking up a stout woven hurdle leaning against a log pile, he began to fasten it onto his left arm for a shield. It was awkward, contrary work, and he knelt down to it, fumbling and forcing at the wicker plating. Looking up, he suddenly found the Tuginda standing beside him. Her clothes were dry, but the black, powdery ash blowing in the air had streaked her face and arms and lay grimy on her hair. Although she was carrying a bow ready strung and a quiver of arrows, she seemed indifferent to the fighting, which was now filling the entire town with its uproar. She said nothing, but just stood looking down at him. "I must go and join in the fight, Sayet," he said. "The young baron will think me a coward. He may be hard-pressed, I cannot tell." Still she said nothing, and he paused, looking up at her, and at the same time trying to thrust his left arm further through the rent which he had made in the hurdle. "Lord Shardik is leaving Ortelga," said the Tuginda at length. "Sayet, the fighting!" "His work here is done, whatever it may have been." "You can hear that it is not. Do not delay me, Sayet, I beg you." "That may be others' work. It is not our work." He stared at her. "Why, what then is our work, if not to fight for Lord Shardik?" "To follow the one whom God has sent." She turned and began to walk back towards the river. Still hesitating, he saw her stoop and pick up something from among the ashes of the burned hut. She stood a moment, weighing it in her hand, and as she moved, he saw that it was a wooden ladle. Then she was gone through the smoke, down the sloping shore. Keldrek let fall his hurdle, thrust the knife into his belt, and followed her. On the bank, Rantzay and Sheldra were waiting beside a canoe drawn up upon the pebbles. Staring over the water, they paid him no attention. Following their gaze, he saw Shardik splashing towards the mainland, along the line of the broken causeway. Close by, shading her eyes against the glitter, the Tuginda was standing on a flat, squared block of stone in the shallows. He took her arm, and together they began to follow Shardik across the strait.